Hello, it's Philip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers in London. Now, I'm a practising barrister at law in Richmond. I cover London and the south of England for the courts, for advocacy services, and I'm also the reviews editor of the Barrister magazine, which is this magazine here. Probably seen it before. It's an excellent magazine produced by Nigel Simmons. Lots of very useful articles you can see in there. And we are producing, there's also some very useful news at the front if you are interested in what is happening. For instance, at the moment we've got a lot on legal aid for this. This is the issue that's current in May 2015 as I record this, this actual review, because what I'm looking at today is not about what's in the magazine at the moment, but what's going to be in the next issue, which is a very special issue to commemorate the sealing of Magna Carta in June 1215. It's now 800 years later, and what we've done is we are going to produce a special magazine to commemorate what happened at Runnymede, and my wife Elizabeth and I have actually written an article, and this actual review is the article with a little bit more added into it, because I can show you a few things. I've had as my starting off point two books. One is this excellent book from Anthony Arledge and Igor Judge, the ex-Lord Chief Justice. It's a first-class book, as you can see, lovely picture at the front, and you can see a huge amount of information in the book. I've done a special review of this book separately. Likewise, we've also got another book, which is from Lincoln Cathedral, and it's this one by Professor Vincent. And there's the side, and then there's the back. This is the glossy, and in fact, here we go. You can see the middle of the book there. You can see what's in a huge amount of information. Both of these books are really first class in terms of the content and the scholarship. What, for instance, they both have is actually a statement of Magna Carta, the actual translation of it. They've got indexes at the back and so forth, and lots of footnotes. You can see all that. Those are bibliographical references and the index. Then at the front you've again got a lot of information. See some of the old pictures. Now, Lincoln Cathedral have a particular relevance. You can see Lincoln Cathedral there. A particular relevance, of course, to Magna Carta for a number of reasons. I'm not going to go into too much detail, because what I'd like to do is give you an insight as to what we said in our review. We've given it the title, which is a quote from the Great Charter itself. To no one will we sell, to no one will we deny, or delay right or justice. We've given it the subtitle, The Terror of Tyrants Throughout the Ages. Magna Carta is reassessed 800 years on by Elizabeth Robson Taylor and Philip Taylor MBE of Richmond Green Chambers. And I'm Philip Taylor doing the actual review for both of us. This is what we say. Worried about threats to your liberty or those of others? Invoke Magna Carta. Many people do, although not many have read it. And in fact, you've got a statement of it in both of these books. I've only taken these two books. I've done reviews of others, but these are the two that strike me as being some of the best at the moment. There are other ones that are equally good, but these are the ones that came to hand. It's therefore not surprising, for despite Magna Carta's historical and legal significance and the amount of learned commentary about it, the translation, the full translation that is, has not been readily or widely available, at least not at every newsagent's in town until now. However, with the public consciousness raised in anticipation of the planned celebrations in this 800th anniversary year, 2015 from 1215, you can now read all you want about Magna Carta, and you can peruse the translation in its magnificent entirety in a number of books on the subject published this year. These being too numerous to mention here, as I've said, but there are two which stand out, and these are the ones I've highlighted as being of particular interest to legal practitioners, anyone who loves the law. The first is Magna Carta Uncovered, and the second is the Professor Vincent's book on Magna Carta with the Foundation of Freedom, 1215 to 2015, as the subtitle. Both of them are first-class books. Predictably, It's the book by Arledge and Judge that's regarded by many as many a legal practitioner as the book of the moment. Well, we would say that anyway, but in fact Lord Judge gave a lecture not so long ago about the book, and again you can see from a lawyer's perspective how helpful it is to have that particular eye to the detail. It's a plain speaking, this particular book is a plain speaking 21st century appraisal of a 13th century legal document, which even in the absence of specific statements on human rights as such, has set the standard for rights and liberties the world over, even though it's been challenged, threatened, belittled and ignored in every century since, including our own one. Now let me talk specifically about clause 40. Read the translation. You can't help but notice that despite the dismissive remarks of some commentators today, and there have been a few, I'm not going to name them, academics included, at least half the clauses in the Great Charter were, and still are, political dynamite, and as relevant and radical now as they were in 1215. Clause 40 is the best known. To no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice. That, in the view of any reasonable reader, does include everybody, not just a band of rebellious barons, as a number of pundits have claimed recently. There is considerable documentary evidence to indicate that the principles of freedom, good governance and the rule of law that were demanded initially unsuccessfully by those barons set important precedents which later generations have emulated and upheld, often in the teeth of opposition. For example, from 1331 to 1351, various statutes extending the right against arbitrary action by the Crown to all men of whatever condition whatsoever is one good illustration. Lamentably, history reveals how often the principles enshrined in Magna Carta have been ignored. But there's no need to retreat into history to note various frightening examples of justice under threat. There have been plenty of such threats in our own century, including proposals to end the right to trial by jury, with the jury system condemned as cumbersome, impractical and costly and so forth by some people. There have been instances too of inordinately lengthy periods of bail, and ostensibly in response to the exigencies of the war on terror, there have been prisoners who have been locked up for months and in certain cases years without charge. Too many examples have emerged of the many ways in which power corrupts, which is why certain utterances in Magna Carta can still be called relevant today. Take, for example, the clauses that limit the powers of bailiffs. Good idea that. There is an insistence that persons in positions of power and authority should at least be qualified for their jobs. Quote, "We will not make," that's a point, "justices, constables, sheriffs or bailiffs who do not know the law of the land and mean to observe it well," thunders clause 45. Well, it's a gripping read because Arledge and Judge, this is this book here, continue the fierce and gripping tale of the conflict and drama, including civil war, and check out the chapter on Robin Hood and the Royal Forests, which actually led to Magna Carta itself. The timeline at the beginning of this book, uncovered, lists the significant events that occurred prior to the Magna Carta and indicates that the document had a long gestation period and a difficult birth. Magna Carta's story began approximately in 1154, when Henry II ascended the throne of England. The decades which followed featured widespread strife, civil unrest and foreign wars, which eventually, under John's reign, emptied the nation's treasury by 1214. This was only one example of John's profligacy and incompetence as a monarch. The fact that John, during his reign, had lost possessions of all the territories in France over which he had once ruled, earning him the nickname Johnny Lackland, or across the Channel, Jean Sans Terre, finally, after further conflicts and further rebellion by the infuriated barons, the Great Charter was granted under seal by King John at Runnymede on the 15th of June 1215. But as most of us realise, this was not the end of the story. A month later, John, observed at the time as gnashing his teeth and biting on sticks to fury, rescinded the charter. He wrote to the Pope demanding that it be annulled, which the Pope duly did, declaring it void after condemning it utterly with some terribly ferocious and quite undiplomatic remarks, which should not be repeated here. After John's death, however, and the following years of regency, the Great Charter, then newly dubbed Magna Carta, was reissued in perpetuity under the seal of John's heir, the young Henry III. Well, thank goodness for that, you may say, except once again the story doesn't end here, nor, as one might suppose, will it ever. Now, this is a compelling story because we then turn to Magna Carta by Vincent. We look at the book. This actually comes from Lincoln Cathedral. This is the special edition from Lincoln Cathedral. Here you have an authoritative work. It's a compelling examination of Magna Carta and its enduring impact on British and world history. Excuse me. Enhanced by stunning illustrations, its engrossing narrative presents Magna Carta as an inspiration for all who love liberty and justice under the rule of law. As I say, it's a lovingly produced book, and it really does bring the subject alive to you. Vincent, who headed a team to write this of 5 experts, have given a very, very substantial commentary. He's actually the Professor of History at the University of East Anglia. Amongst his other credentials, was a consultant on Magna Carta to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and joint curator of the British Library's Magna Carta exhibition 2015, which is still going on as I record this review. To understand the sheer potency and durability of the Charter, one must consider its original purpose, which was to impose long-needed reforms on the corrupt government of King John. And there's quite a lot about him in the book, and a lot of other books about King John, I hasten to add, which we reviewed. But each book has its own little slant on how dreadful this man was. Discussing the tyranny of King John, Vincent is in no doubt that this benighted monarch was tyrannous indeed, lecherous too, with no redeeming qualities. Hell itself is defiled by the presence of King John, said the famous 13th century monastic chronicler Matthew Paris. It appears that the professor, that's Professor Vincent and his team, have unearthed a mine of original source material that reveals a lot more about King John and the barons than has been generally known in the past. One example is the Magna Carta sureties, in which the 25 barons appointed in 1215 to enforce Magna Carta are identified by name. Apparently they were supported by almost 2,000 other knights. Also interesting, as well as incriminating, are the extensive descriptions of certain documents that preceded Magna Carta, notably the Chancery Rolls. Many of you may have heard of that, which, among other documentation, provide much evidence about the monarch's methods of imparting justice by means of his own special blend of influence and intimidation. Under John's misrule, then, justice could still be bought. Cases often went ahead only after painful delays, themselves the result of endless procedural complications or the sheer difficulty of access to royal judges, either at Westminster or in the localities. If any of this sounds unfamiliar, uncomfortably familiar rather, perhaps it ought to. Just wonder, 800 years on, where we've got to. We have improved, but there are still lots of delays, hence our title for this review. Like Magna Carta Uncovered, which is this book, Knowledge and Judge, this one, by Vincent, and his study itself also provides the translation of the Charter's actual text, complete with handy glossary, which again helps to explain some of the words that are used. Apart from being rather gorgeous and glossy, the book stresses the significance of Magna Carta as a genuinely radical document and repudiates those views, including some lawyers who've loftily dismissed it as a child of its time, concerning only with the rights of a few barons. It's not like that, it's a bit bigger than that, with respect to those who say otherwise. These critics, says Vincent, have ignored the Charter's enduring statements against arbitrary power and the principles of freedom under the law. It shouldn't be too surprising then that Magna Carta, the most famous document in the history of England, and perhaps the world, has been cited in parliamentary, congressional and constitutional debates more frequently than any other text, says Vincent, save only for the Christian Bible. And so, in this anniversary year of 2015, the peculiar power of Magna Carta continues to cast its spell. Thousands of people, more or less a spirit of pilgrimage possibly, flock to see the original copies which survive and are on display at the British Library. The Charter's acquired almost the status of a sacred scroll. This is a tad ironic in that it's a purely secular document, devoid of any religious relevance or references. But in these perilous times, it's a sobering thought that so many citizens feel need to worship at its shrine, so to speak, perhaps now more than ever. Let me turn to Runnymede, because we visited Runnymede. I've taken quite a lot of photographs, which have been used in some articles. And we actually visited some of the sites. Cooper's Hill is actually the little hill overlooking the picture you've got here in the... This is actually a picture of Runnymede here. And the hill, halfway up the hill, is where the actual monument is that they have built, the American Bar Association. So we'll talk a bit about that. It's worth mentioning that a special tribute was paid to Magna Carta in the mid-20th century in the form of a memorial erected by the American Bar Association. It's on the banks of the River Thames at Runnymede, near where John was forced by those pesky barons to affix his seal to the Charter. It's not unfair to say there's nowhere on earth where Magna Carta is more venerated than in America. And do remember that we don't think John could read and write properly, so he had to seal it. But that's probably because I want to get at him, quite rightly too. And with the turmoil of the 13th century long gone, this, what is actually a tranquil spot, known as Cooper's Hill, is presided over now by the National Trust, which runs a tea shop nearby. Do where your well is if you go. Frequently flooded by the Thames, it's in the floodplain. The grassy water meadows leading up to the site are probably just as boggy as they were in the 13th century, but it's certainly worth a visit. And it's an important area, just to think back 800 years as to what happened. If some or all of this has whetted your appetite for tracking down other historically significant documentation inspired by Magna Carta, take a look at the 6 appendices in Magna Carta Uncovered, that document, which include the Petition of Rights, 1628, the Bill of Rights 1689, and the Bill of Rights 1789 United States version. One might be tempted to add here that there was another and much earlier document upon which Magna Carta may have arguably had an indirect rather than direct influence, namely the Declaration of Arbroath in 1324. Obviously that's an earlier document, but after the sealing of the one in 1215. Now the Declaration of Arbroath is important, and it was a plea to the Pope in epistolary form for Scottish freedom from English conquest and domination. Interesting, 1324, we're in 2015 rather, with a general election just about to take place. Sadly, like Magna Carta over a century earlier, the Declaration initially sank almost without trace, condemned to oblivion by yet another Pope. However, with that inbuilt virtue of survivability similar to that of Magna Carta, it eventually became the inspiration, along with Magna Carta itself, for much of the content of the American Declaration of Independence. So you can see the tremendous effect that the Great Charter itself, and then the other things that have happened since, all of which is that thread running through about the rights of an individual in any society that we live in. Freedom, it seems, is a fragile plant, vulnerable to continuing onslaughts by those who detest and fear it as a threat to their authority and power. and not without vigilance and struggle does it survive, but survive it does. The battle of the barons against their tyrannous king has been repeated in other ways and by other means, some peaceful, some not, down through the generations. So it's reassuring to recall that under the seal of Henry III, Magna Carta was reissued in perpetuity. Now that's a solemn legal term, we all know about it, but one that has turned out to be prophetic. Repressed and reviled by tyrants from one century to the next, Magna Carta has kept bouncing back because it continues to champion that ever-present and all-too-human yearning for freedom and for justice, which, let's hope, will continue on in perpetuity. Thank you anyway to everybody who's been involved, certainly in the anniversary of Magna Carta. I think the Barrister magazine itself, just to mention it again, we will be doing the commemoration version of it, and do have a look at it when it comes out, because the Barrister itself has taken an important step forward in this area, and I hope the readers find the articles that we've produced of some help. Thank you to all concerned who've helped me in producing this particular review. The books by Anthony Arledge and Ivor Judge and by Nicholas Vincent have been really helpful as well, and the visit to Runnymede was a special event, certainly for me. I've been there before, but I looked at it slightly differently when I went again because of the history. And as I said before, right at the end of this review, and I'll just repeat it, it continues to champion that ever-present and all-too-human yearning for freedom and justice, which, let's hope, will continue on in perpetuity. We hope it will. Enjoy the celebrations in June. Bye-bye.